Hello and welcome to the Stockout. This is your show at FreightWaves for all things related to the consumer packaged goods industry, the CPG industry. This is a show we set aside 26 minutes every week to go through what I think is important on the CPG front, the items I've talked about in my newsletter, other things that we've said around the site. And we did have a lot to say on the CPG industry this week, in addition to the typical FreightWaves, the Stockout newsletter. Some of my colleagues wrote up articles on Kraft Heinz and their Lunchables, and another one wrote a humorous piece on Cadbury cream eggs. That was a Mondelez property, so I can talk about both of those things, as well as Utz reported earnings and the freight markets. I can talk about that like I usually do. It seems like we've had at least some signs of stabilization that might be partially due to March being a typically strong month. So I'll talk about those things. And for anyone who has not already signed up for the Stockout newsletter, would encourage you to do that. Please go to www.freightwaves.com/the Stockout. It's going to be right up there and on top of newsletters. Also a lot of great other newsletters to keep you informed on your industry. I think the retail newsletter is very relevant for CPG industry, in addition to the cold chain newsletter and really sort of the modes newsletter. There's a lot of important things in there too. So I encourage you to do that. And before we get into today's topics here, I'm just going to highlight a few upcoming guests on the Stockout. Don't have a guest today, but next week, March 13th, have Brian Gerber. He's the co-founder and CEO of a company called Hemper.com, as well as Hara Supply. So this is a company that sells cannabis-themed subscription boxes and sells all manner of cannabis paraphernalia. You can imagine what those are. Go to Hemper.com and check it out for yourself. And whether cannabis is something that you're interested in or not, I think we can really dig into a lot of the challenges associated with this direct-to-consumer commerce subscription type boxes. A lot of the logistical challenges associated with that, I think, are very relevant for other types of subscription-based products. That's something CPGs are trying to make a big push into. Really drives a lot of stickiness, recurring revenue. It's really a valuable source of income if you can get it. And so I think that'll be pretty insightful. And then the following week, March 20th, we have a company called General Logistics Systems. It's a company that does shipping and tracing, and they're going to explain why we think regional carriers can compete with sort of the big duopoly of FedEx and UPS, and maybe disrupt that duopoly. And if I had to guess as to why, it has to do with certain service requirements. One of the things they move heavily is wine, which has a lot of special service requirements. It's heavy. A lot of it's imported, so it has to go through customs. It's breakable, high value product, and so really a lot goes into that. So we're going to learn about the wine logistics, among other, sort of small package logistics in that presentation. And then March 27th, this is one I'm really excited about, Kelly Thompson, head of North America for Dumatook. So Dumatook is a sugar reduction startup, and they have this product called Incredo Sugar, which is designed to improve the efficiency of sugar delivery. So your sweet taste receptors think you're getting the full sugar product, even though the sweetness, so the perception of sweetness is there, while the actual sugar is reduced by 30 to 50%, no compromise on taste or texture. Have a little bit of a hard time wrapping my head around the technology there, but that one should be really interesting as well. And that's a part of a big push to improve the healthfulness of consumer food products. So I hope you can join us for those sessions on the Stockout. And so with that, I'll talk a little bit about my most recent, the Stockout newsletter. And the topic of the newsletter was retailers have this big push for convenience. I think that was sort of the big takeaway from me. There's, an image of the newsletter. That's someone in red. Maybe he works for Target, maybe he doesn't. Target people wear red, and potentially could load up your pickup truck. And one of the things that Target talked about in its analyst call is not just having sort of this the pickup of the items you ordered online, but also making this big push into returns. And so you can actually do returns from Target while driving through, pick up, some milk or whatever items you need at the same time while your child is sleeping in the back seat. They said they're still working on doing that for their Starbucks, components there too. But they think that that's a big part of their their sales, and that's getting to be about 10% of their business is the e-commerce. In addition to same day fulfillment, which they do via Shipt, they do the pickups in most of their locations now. So a big push that Target's making into convenience. I think targeting sort of the higher sort of upper middle class consumer, maybe a busier consumer. And actually, Walmart has a lot of examples of this too. Walmart's rolling out this service called Scan and Go, which essentially means you walk into a retailer, you bring up your app, as you go in and put the items in your cart, you scan them on your phone, and that reduces any need to check out, wait for any kind of checkout counter, just leave the store right away. So that can save a lot of time, particularly on a busy day. They say they're also doing same day delivery out of 4,000 locations, which, considering how many locations they have in the U.S., which is something like 5,000 locations, it's really considering it's most of them, and really start leaning into convenience. And it's pretty clear to me, at least, why the retailers are focusing on this. I think Amazon has demonstrated that people are willing to pay for the added convenience. I think Walmart and Target trying to target the higher income consumers. Walmart's actually had a lot of success with that, targeting higher income consumers on the grocery side and getting those consumers to not only pick up more of their groceries at a Walmart, but also purchasing more of their sort of also consumable products, things like personal care products, paper towels, things of that nature. And then, really a lot of those it's convenience type services, whether we're talking about Scan and Go, pick up on the go, those type of things, require the consumer to download an app, and that app, enhances the ability to track consumer data, which is very valuable for the retailer, which a lot of these retailers have growing revenue segments of selling consumer data, which is very valuable to the CPG companies. They can target not just sort of specific demographics, but specific customers that have bought competing products. So someone bought a competing product that competes directly with your CPG. You can then offer that specific person a promotion. I do think part of the reason why Kroger is acquiring Albertsons, it's not just to streamline their supply chain. I think it also has a lot to do with the data value of the data collection, which should really be enhanced after that merger. And then the convenience aspect, I think, really helps these retailers compete better with Costco, which is essentially a business model of consumers trading convenience. They trade off convenient hours. They can trade off convenience of finding things, trade off convenience of waiting in lines, all for lower prices. And so it sort of, on a comparative basis, makes those other retailers look even more convenient versus Costco. So it's clear, I think, kind of the angle that they're participating in there. As far as what that means for CPGs, I think it's going to mean fewer impulse purchases. If they streamline all of these shopping trips, I think the impulse purchases are already under pressure. In the UK, you have this new law where they can't have candy at checkout counters or end of aisles, which those things are designed to boost impulse purchases. So that hurts a company, I think, like Mondelez, that has a significant amount of its sales based on impulse purchases. And then, all the data collection stuff I already talked about. I think that really is an opportunity for CPGs, considering that they can really leverage, who the target customers are. Now, with all those added convenience items, I think it also does make it more convenient for thieves. I think the latest news out of Walmart is they're closing 9 stores, including the final 2 in Portland, Oregon, which has particularly lax laws and enforcement related to shoplifting. I think it's one thing that we've seen sort of across the retail industry is the increase in shrinkage. It's something both Walmart and Target have called out. It was one of Target's recent analyst calls, a quarter or two ago, they called out higher shrinkage. And then when they gave their 2023 guidance, they talked about that as being an expected headwind for 2023 versus all of 2022. So they sort of see the pattern has increased. They don't see any reason why it would retrench to previous years. So kind of a sad commentary on our culture that sort of the shrinkage seems to be higher at the retailers. With that, I'll move on to the next topic here, which is that Lunchables are going to be sold directly to schools. So this was an article that my colleague Rachel Premack, editorial director, wrote up in the last few days. And this was a little bit surprising to me. I mean, I think the original question that I had was, how was this going to interact with and comply with the new rules for food health that's going to be required for school lunch programs. So just in the last couple of weeks, the USDA rolled out new rules to on a nationwide basis that public schools have to comply not just with the trans fat laws, which they already were complying with. This, what we're seeing on the screen, is a newsletter I wrote a couple of weeks ago where I go into some detail on this. But they're going to have to step down the amount of sugar starting in 2024, 2025, and then there's certain increments sort of after that where they have to step down the amount of sugar, the amount of sodium inside the school lunches. I can give a couple of stats on this, which I thought were pretty eyebrow raising. About 40 years ago, about 5% of children were overweight, let's say in the early 80s, and now it's 20%. So it's basically quadrupled the number of children that are overweight or obese. And yes, some of that's related to activity, but it's also clear that a lot of this is related to food consumption. In the 1970s, the average person ate 123 pounds of sugar every year. That's a lot. Today, it's 152 pounds of sugar every year. So a lot of it is just simply sugar related. In the early 2000s, we made trans fats kind of persona non grata. I think now sugar is kind of the new trans fat, and maybe in the future salt becomes the new sugar because of the link there between salt and hypertension. So I think this is kind of the direction that we're moving in. And Rachel calls out a few sort of interesting questions in her article. I mean, one of which is, okay, the Lunchables that are sold into schools have to comply with these rules, but the ones sold at retailer do not. So do you have a better tasting Lunchable on retail shelves, a worse tasting one in the school cafeteria? Does that then make the kids ask their parents to buy the ones on the retail shelves, and they just bring those into the school? And the ones that are sold directly in the school, maybe they're a little bit healthier, maybe they're not. Those just sort of serve as advertising. But in any event, it does seem like Kraft Heinz has sort of found a new potentially lucrative, revenue stream that's pretty standardized across, everywhere. So you could see why that could be a relatively high margin product. And maybe this is one thing that, sort of gets around my initial thought with some of these USDA rules for improved, lunches. I thought that would be sort of a lower margin type business. Maybe there's some extra cost associated with, making those Lunchables healthier to comply with the standard, but still a standardized product, nationwide. I think it's probably a good thing for Kraft Heinz, maybe not a great thing for, the healthfulness of students, but we'll see how that progresses. I'll move on to the next article that was written by my colleague Steve Barrett, who is primarily an editor, a copy editor, and he wrote an article on the Cadbury egg theft in England. And so there was a truck carrying a whopping 200,000 Cadbury cream eggs. It's a lot of cream eggs in a truck. This was stolen. So Steve wrote this humorous piece, as he does from time to time, on the theft of these Cadbury cream eggs. I saw some other articles that saying that they thought that the value of this was $40,000. I saw another one that says it was something in the $30,000 range. So that would come out to 24 cents an egg. And at retailer, these are at least $1 an egg, sometimes, $1.25 an egg. So this is a very high margin product. I didn't realize it was quite that high margin. But Steve writes this article to talk about how much he hates Cadbury cream eggs. I think it's a product that you either love or hate. A lot of people feel like it just doesn't feel like Easter without the Cadbury cream eggs, without their Peeps. I think there's an equal number of people who hate them. But I want to read an excerpt from Steve's article. He said, the eggs with caramel have a certain charm. It's hard to screw up caramel. But the ones with the insides that look like raw egg, white and yolk wrapped in a chocolate orb, no, just no. The interior of a Cadbury cream egg is made up of largely of white goo that can never look fully cooked, no matter how you boil, fry, scramble, poach, or Benedict in it. Who on earth finds that appealing? So basically, Steve says, well, I'm surprised anyone even bothered to track down, file a report of 200,000 Cadbury cream eggs. Steve seems to think that this is a service to humanity to see those 200,000 Cadbury cream eggs disappear. So the Guardian said, well, this fairly high value food type product. This must have been kind of a professional job. Not something that would be random. But in any event, we've done our fair share of ripping CPG companies in the past week, between calling Lunchables, Rachel calling Lunchables disgusting, and Steve saying that Cadbury cream eggs are essentially uneatable. I'm sure Rachel meant disgusting in terms of Lunchables in the nicest possible way. But with that, I'll move on to just talk about Utz just a little bit. Like Utz, it's sort of nostalgic. Because I lived in Baltimore for a long time, probably the best tasting potato chips I've ever had, Utz brands. I think people in Baltimore take a lot of pride in that. That Utz is a local brand. It seems like they're pretty much everywhere. And basically what Utz said, I thought was kind of interesting. They said they had no plans to take any broad-based pricing actions, at least further. And one thing they said about elasticity is they said that the elasticity has been pretty modest to non-existent. They do expect that consumer pressure to start to grow. So not terribly inconsistent with what we've seen from other CPG companies. Some are saying, well, their prices still need to rise to make up for the cost inflation. Utz specifically said they're now kind of offsetting that cost inflation, and now prices can take a breather. So good news for their fans. But I think consistent with a lot of what we've heard, consumers in a pretty tough place right now. And also interesting, Utz eliminated about 350 SKUs. That's a trend we've heard a lot in the CPG industry, where they've taken a hard look at their SKUs and cut the worst performing SKUs. I don't think anything with Utz beats their original potato chips. With that, I'll move on to the freight markets. I always like to talk a little bit about the freight markets on this show, and always talk a little bit about Sonar. And I think the freight markets, there's starting to be some evidence that the freight markets are at least showing some signs of stabilization. You sort of go back the last couple of weeks and what sort of Walmart and Target said. The sort of the panic of having too much in inventory seems to be over, where those retailers are much more happy with the amount of inventory they have right now, even though they say, apparel's still a little heavy. People seem to have stopped buying clothes. Maybe that's work from home. Maybe that's cutting back on just expenses. Who knows? But have a van contract chart I want to show from Sonar, if we can get that up. And basically what the van contract rates show is that white line is 2023, and the van contract rates year to date down 9.2% when you compare the average 2023 rate to the average 2022 rate. Keep in mind, those do not include fuel surcharges, although the fuel is starting to get closer to where we're lapping a high period of last year, but still believe that's a little bit higher than it was last year. And that decrease this year versus last year, that does come after 2 years of steep rate increases, going from the 2020, which is that orange line, into 2021, which is the blue line. So at a 2-year stack, these line haul van rates still higher than they were. What's also interesting is you just look at the sort of trajectory of the green line that sort of declined throughout last year, and into this year, it's just sort of stabilized, sort of flatlined right around that $2 and let's call it $2.60 level. $2.57 is the last is the last metric. So not a lot has happened since late January. And I want to pull up the next chart, which is the van contract rates, which is that same line. It's just not on a yearly basis. So van contract rates there, line haul basis, so excluding fuel surcharges, are in white, and then the spot rates, also excluding fuel surcharges, we use an algorithm to take out the fuel, is in orange, and you see the spot rates for dry vans still significantly below contract rates. Let's call it 64 cents a mile on average below the contract rates. Now you might say, well, why would anyone move freight on the contract market when you can move it cheaper on the spot market. And I think the reason is that some of the big shippers, including some of the big CPGs, are saying, well, we already, negotiated a rate that was somewhat lower. You can see kind of earlier last year was kind of in that $3 range. So already had sort of a significant discount. The fuel coming down off its high, is lower cost to those shippers as well. And at the same time, they don't want to, not give those, they want to provide the carriers with a certain amount of just base load freight volume because they want to have that capacity available. They don't want their loads to be their tenders to be the first tenders that are rejected when the market does turn. So they're trying to be a kind of a shipper of choice. We'll sort of take care of you when the market's a little bit looser. You'll take care of us when the market's a little bit tighter, because things will tighten up again. We don't know exactly when that'll be. I think most likely it'll be some combination of inventory restocking at some point. The retailers and others will have destocked their inventory to such a degree that those inventories will need to be rebuilt. I don't think we're quite there yet, although we're getting closer. And then at some point, enough capacity will come out of the market where that will tighten up the market. And capacity, that's kind of a slow process. It's really kind of lags the market conditions. Market condition has to be kind of loose for a while, and that causes the capacity to come out. So a combination of those two things. At some point, I think the shippers that take care of their carriers now should hopefully be in a better position. With that, I'll move on to the last topic, which is just a little bit of a recap of last week's episode of People Speaking Rail. I also do this other show, which is on Thursdays on the railroad industry. If you're at all interested in the railroad industry, I encourage you to check that out. Do that with my colleague Joanna Marsh, who does the editorial writing of People Speaking Rail. I talk a little bit about the data that we're seeing in the railroad industry. But we had a really great guest on Thursday. It was Daniel Elliott, who is the former chairman of the U.S. Surface Transportation Board, and really has had a long career in the railroad industry. He's currently an attorney at a firm in Washington, D.C. that works primarily on behalf of shippers and other railroad constituents. And I'll go through a few of the highlights for me. Is he's still hearing lots of complaints from shippers on service issues. Maybe they've improved a little bit, but there's still plenty of sort of anecdotal complaints on railroad service. I asked him of all the things that are on the current STB's docket right now, sort of what would really sort of move the needle in terms of the shippers maybe getting a little bit of a break on service or rates. And the thing that came to mind for him was on the reciprocal switching, which, even if there isn't all that much freight that is diverted from one railroad to the other, the purpose of reciprocal switching is to enhance competition by mandating that there's an alternate quote to move certain freight and within a certain radius of where the freight is originally headed. It's that way in some other countries, and he thought that would be the sort of the single biggest needle mover on service and rates. Also asked him, because he did have a long background with rail labor, sort of why exactly the railroads are having a hard time recruiting and retaining workers, which is something they have not had a hard time doing historically. And I thought he gave kind of the definitive answer, and I'm not going to be able to do it justice, but essentially it's some combination of the workers having to do more with less amid precision scheduled, railroading, and also just a lot of the work rules make it such that the employees are on call 24/7, 365. He's also thought that there was kind of a mindset change where the workers in general prioritize, lifestyle, sort of being at home, family time, more so than they have in the past. Sort of gives the example of if you're at your kid's, baseball game and you get a call and you're a railroad worker, you have to leave, right in the middle of the game to go work, and you might, work, very far away from home. It's kind of, not just long hours when, during the 12-hour, shifts, but it's uncertain hours, and that uncertainty makes things, difficult. So even though the railroads are making a big, push now to give more, sick days to a lot of these unionized workers. It almost seems like this is going to be a generational challenge for the railroads to recruit and retain workers, which in turn makes me think that the railroad service issues are going to persist. That's been the main, culprit of the railroad service issues, has been sort of a lack of workers. Finally, Dan Elliott talked a lot about how the regulatory process really takes a long time, sort of went through that whole process and explained exactly why some changes to railroad regulations take a number of years, and believes that the thing that the Surface Transportation Board is currently the most focused on is approving the Canadian Pacific acquisition of Kansas City Southern, or not. And that's sort of the main thing that they're focused on now, and thinks maybe some of these other things are on the back burner because that's such a major project. So with that, encourage everyone to sign up for the CPG newsletter at www.freightwaves.com/the stockouts. And that's all I had for you today. Hope everyone has a great day.